Imagine you are one of the most highly trained special operations soldiers on the planet. You have spent years mastering weapons, demolitions, survival, and close-quarters combat. You arrive in the English countryside, expecting to learn from your allies, quietly confident that nobody does this better than you. And then, a man in flip-flops, carrying a battered rifle and a cup of tea, walks past you on his way to brief an operation that will make your jaw hit the floor. That moment happened, and nothing was ever quite the same again. Hi, my name is Arnold, and this is Delta Force Chronicles. The special relationship, and it was very special. To understand why this story matters, you need to understand what the 1970s looked like for Anglo-American Special Operations cooperation. The short answer is, it looked remarkably intimate for two nations that publicly pretended most of this work did not exist. The Special Air Service, based out of their now legendary home in Hereford, England, had by this point already established themselves as the gold standard in counterterrorism and unconventional warfare. Their storming of the Iranian embassy in 1980 would later cement that reputation in the public consciousness. But within the special operations community, the SAS were already spoken about in an almost reverent tone, well before that particular Sunday afternoon television spectacle. The exchange arrangement between the SAS and their American counterparts, primarily U.S. Army Special Forces, and later the U.S. Navy SEALs, was not widely advertised. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply productive. British operators rotated through U.S. programs. American operators came to Hereford. And what they found there consistently surprised them. Not because the facilities were impressive. They were not. Hereford was famously, almost aggressively, unimpressive. What surprised them was everything else. The SAS had a culture unlike anything the Americans had encountered in their own military. It was flat, informal, brutally meritocratic. A staff sergeant could and would challenge a major's plan in a briefing room without a second thought, provided the challenge was tactically sound. Rank existed, but it did not dominate. What dominated was competence, and the Americans, to their considerable credit, noticed. The Americans arrive at Hereford. Now here is where I should say that the specific exchange visit at the center of this story involved a small team of U.S. Army Special Forces operators, the Green Berets, rotating through Hereford as part of the standing exchange program that had been quietly running for several years. These were not junior soldiers on a jolly. These were seasoned, experienced men. Some had Vietnam behind them. They had seen the sharp end, and they knew it. They arrived expecting a professional, well-organized military establishment. And in fairness, the SAS delivered that. What they did not expect was the atmosphere. Walking into the SAS compound for the first time has been described by more than one American operator as walking into a particularly well-armed university common room. Men were drinking tea at all hours. Arguments about tactics were conducted at the same casual volume as arguments about football. And yes, at least one individual was observed conducting weapon maintenance in a state of dress that suggested he had either just come back from the beach or was planning to go. One American operator, recounting the experience years later, described watching an SAS trooper wander into a briefing room carrying a mug of tea in one hand, his rifle slung so loosely it was practically horizontal, wearing flip-flops. Not as a joke, not as some kind of deliberate provocation, just because it was what he was wearing. The Americans' first instinct, shaped by years of U.S. military culture, was that this man was about to get corrected by someone senior. Nobody corrected him. Nobody even looked twice. What the Americans were witnessing was not indiscipline. It was something far more interesting than that. It was a unit so deeply confident in its own capability and so thoroughly unbothered by the performance of military professionalism that it had simply stopped performing it. The SAS did not need to look like soldiers. Because there was absolutely no question that they were soldiers, very, very good ones. The briefing that stopped them cold. The exercise itself, the one that genuinely stopped the American team in their tracks, was laid out in a briefing that, by most accounts, lasted no more than 20 minutes. For context, the American approach to mission briefings at this time was thorough, to say the least. The 5-paragraph order format, detailed annexes, contingency planning laid out in full, all of it entirely valid. All of it reflecting a military culture that valued process and structure. The briefing was different. The scenario was a classic, a hostile compound, a defended target, multiple enemy personnel, a time-sensitive extraction window, the kind of problem that both teams would have spent considerable time planning and preparing for under their respective systems. The SAS troop commander stood up, looked at his men, and in a manner that one American observer later described as a man ordering a takeaway rather than planning a combat operation, outlined the essential problem and the essential solution. The enemy was here. The target was this. The approach would be from this direction, because that approach was the one the enemy would consider least likely, and therefore, it was the correct one. Questions were fielded. Adjustments were made on the spot, verbally, without ceremony. And then, it was done. What struck the Americans was not the brevity, though the brevity was striking. What struck them was the underlying logic. Every single decision in that briefing was traceable to a clear, tactical principle. There was no padding. There was no process for the sake of process. The SAS had, through years of operational experience, stripped the planning cycle down to its essential load-bearing elements and thrown everything else away. And the man delivering it was, in fact, still wearing flip-flops. I want to be clear here. I am not saying the flip-flops were tactically significant. They were not. But they became, for the Americans present, a kind of symbol for everything they were absorbing. That real capability does not always announce itself the way you expect. The exercise went ahead. And this is where things moved from surprising to genuinely revelatory for the American team. The SAS approach to the simulated compound assault demonstrated several things simultaneously that the Americans had not seen packaged together in quite this way before. First, there was the speed of decision-making at the lowest level. Individual troopers were making tactical choices in real time without waiting for direction from above. Not because command had broken down, but because command had deliberately pushed authority down to the point where it was most useful, the man with eyes on the problem. Second, there was the improvisation. At one point during the exercise, the planned entry point became untenable. In most military units of the period, this would have triggered a consolidation, a reassessment, a request for guidance. In the SAS troop, it triggered approximately 4 seconds of hand signals and a seamless shift to an alternative approach that had not been formally briefed, but that every man in the team understood because they all shared the same tactical framework. They did not need to be told what to do because they had already internalized the answer to the question their commander would have asked. Third, and perhaps most striking of all to the Americans present, was what happened after the simulated target was secured. The debrief. Every member of the troop, regardless of rank, sat down and went through what had worked and what had not, with a directness that would have been professionally dangerous in most other military environments. A trooper contradicted his sergeant. The sergeant agreed with him. Adjustments were noted. Nobody's feelings appeared to be involved. One of the American operators later said, and I am paraphrasing because the exact quote has been lost to the fog of classification, that watching that debrief was more instructive than anything else he had seen during the entire rotation, because it told him something fundamental about how the SAS sustained their capability over time. They were genuinely, institutionally committed to getting better, not to appearing good, to actually being good. Now, one of the SAS troopers conducted the majority of the post-exercise clearing drills still in the flip-flops. I feel this needs to be acknowledged. What the Americans took home. The impact of these exchange visits on American special operations cannot be overstated. The most direct and documented line runs through Charlie Beckwith, the U.S. Army Special Forces colonel who had served on attachment to the SAS in Hereford in the 1960s and who returned to the United States with a mission. Beckwith had seen what a unit built entirely on the SAS model could achieve, and he spent the better part of a decade fighting the U.S. Army bureaucracy to be allowed to build one. That unit was Delta Force, formally activated in 1977 and ready for operations by 1979. Delta Force's selection process, its squadron structure, its culture of empowered decision-making at the lowest level, all of it traced directly back to Hereford. Dick Meadows, the legendary Special Forces soldier who accompanied Beckwith on that original SAS attachment, carried those same lessons through his entire subsequent career. The man who would later walk covertly into Tehran ahead of Operation Eagle Claw had been shaped, in part, by the same Hereford environment that produced the flip-flop incident. The exchange visits of the 1970s also had a direct line to SEAL Team 6. Richard Marcinko, the founder of SEAL Team 6, drew inspiration from the Special Boat Service, the SAS maritime equivalent, in building what would become the U.S. Navy's premier counterterrorism unit. The British model, in both its Army and naval forms, left fingerprints all over the Tier 1 American units that would go on to define special operations for the next half-century. What the British had understood, and what the Americans were in the process of learning during those Hereford rotations, was that genuine special operations capability is a culture product. You cannot mandate it through regulation or produce it through equipment procurement. It grows from a particular set of values, pushed down into the lowest levels of an organization, and then sustained through relentless, honest, sometimes uncomfortable self-assessment. The kind of self-assessment where a trooper contradicts his sergeant, and the sergeant says, "Fair point," and nobody considers that unusual. The legacy, the story of those exchange visits, and the flip-flop moment that became something of a legend within the community is ultimately a story about what real excellence looks like when it stops worrying about appearances. The SAS in the 1970s were not performing capability for the benefit of their American guests. They were simply operating the way they always operated, informally, directly, with every ounce of energy directed at the actual problem rather than the presentation of the solution. That is a harder thing to build than it sounds. Most military organizations, most organizations of any kind, expend enormous energy on the performance of competence, on looking the part. The SAS had evolved past that at some point in their institutional development, and the result was a unit that could brief a compound assault in 20 minutes, execute it with seamless improvisation, debrief it with brutal honesty, and do all of the above in beachwear if the occasion demanded. The Americans who rotated through Hereford in that period went home changed. Some of them went on to build the units that would define a generation of American warfare. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the Intelligence Support Activity, all of them carrying some trace of what they had absorbed in a drafty English compound from men who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. The flip-flops, for what it is worth, probably stayed in Hereford, but everything else came with them. That is the story of the SAS exchange program and the moment that quietly rewrote the American Special Operations Rulebook. If you want to go deeper on Delta Force, the Intelligence Support Activity, or any of the other units we have covered on this channel, the links are below and the archive goes back further than you might expect. If you found this one useful, a like and a subscribe cost you nothing, and tell the algorithm that this kind of content is worth pushing. And if you have a story you think belongs on Delta Force Chronicles, drop it in the comments. Some of the best leads I have ever followed came from people watching from places I would never have expected. My name is Arnold. This is Delta Force Chronicles. I will see you in the next one.